Shattered Grace. Chapter 1. A Perfect Mask. Caroline Harper stood in the warm glow of the Cedar Ridge Community Church foyer, her smile as radiant as the stained glass windows casting colorful patterns across the polished floor. To everyone around her, she was the picture of a devoted wife and a pillar of the congregation. But behind that polished exterior lurked a secret that had been festering for a decade, threatening to unravel everything. She adjusted the hem of her modest floral dress as her husband, Michael, chatted enthusiastically with Pastor Jonathan Grace a few feet away. Her pulse quickened at the sight of Jonathan. Despite his unassuming appearance, short-cropped sandy hair, a sharp suit slightly frayed at the cuffs, he radiated an aura of authority. His eyes, blue and piercing, flickered toward Caroline for the briefest moment. The unspoken connection between them was electric, forbidden, and intoxicating. Michael, ever oblivious, clapped Jonathan on the shoulder and laughed heartily. "Another incredible sermon, Pastor Grace. You have a way of making the word come alive." Jonathan smiled, his expression practiced and smooth. "It's a gift, Michael. And the real joy is seeing families like yours so committed to the church." Caroline barely heard the exchange, her mind swirling with memories of whispered confessions and stolen moments. It had started so innocently, or at least, that's what she told herself. A decade ago, she had been a lonely wife, aching for attention in a marriage that had grown stale. Jonathan had offered her counsel, a sympathetic ear when Michael was too distracted by his business ventures to notice her growing despair. But Jonathan's counsel had quickly turned into something darker. What began as kind words evolved into lingering touches, secret meetings, and eventually, the ultimate betrayal. Later that evening, Caroline prepared dinner while Michael rattled on about his day. The clatter of pots and pans drowned out most of his words, but she caught enough to realize he was talking about an upcoming men's retreat Jonathan had organized. 3 days in the wilderness, just the guys. "It'll be good to unplug and reflect," Michael said, his face lighting up with enthusiasm. "You think Pastor Grace is a good man, don't you, Caroline?" Her hand froze mid-stir. She forced a smile, turning to face him. "Of course. He's inspiring." Michael grinned, satisfied. He kissed her cheek before taking his plate to the living room, where the faint hum of a football game soon filled the house. Caroline exhaled, gripping the edge of the counter. Guilt clawed at her chest, but the thrill of her affair was too powerful to resist. She hated what she had become, but Jonathan had a way of making her believe they were destined to be together, that their love was righteous even in its sin. That night, her phone buzzed as she lay beside Michael's sleeping form. She glanced at the screen, her heart skipping a beat at Jonathan's name. "Jonathan, meet me at the usual spot. Midnight." Her fingers hovered over the screen. Every instinct screamed at her to ignore him, to put an end to the madness. But as she glanced at her husband's peaceful face, the weight of her dissatisfaction bore down on her. With trembling hands, she slipped out of bed, grabbing her coat and keys. The church parking lot was deserted, the towering building looming in the moonlight like a silent witness to her sins. Jonathan's car was already there, its headlights off. Caroline climbed into the passenger seat, the scent of his cologne immediately enveloping her. "You're late," he said, his voice low and teasing. "I almost didn't come," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. Jonathan reached over, his hand resting on hers. "But you did. Because you can't stay away and neither can I." She looked into his eyes, the magnetic pull undeniable. In that moment, the guilt and fear melted away, leaving only the intoxicating thrill of their forbidden love. "What are we doing, Jonathan?" she asked, her voice cracking. "This can't go on forever." He leaned closer, his gaze intense. "We'll find a way, Caroline. We just have to be patient. Michael, he's in the way of our happiness. But every obstacle can be removed." His words sent a chill down her spine, but she didn't pull away. Instead, she let herself drown in the fantasy he painted, the promise of a life unburdened by her husband, a life where she and Jonathan could finally be free. As dawn approached, Caroline slipped back into bed, her heart heavy with both exhilaration and dread. Michael stirred beside her, mumbling something incoherent before settling back into sleep. She stared at the ceiling, the weight of her choices pressing down on her. The perfect mask she wore was beginning to crack, and beneath it, something dark and dangerous was taking root. Chapter 2. The Pastor's Prey. The next morning, sunlight streamed through the curtains, painting the bedroom in soft golds and whites. Caroline Harper sat at the edge of the bed, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. The night's meeting with Jonathan replayed in her mind like a scene from a forbidden drama, his touch, his voice, his dangerous promises. But it was Jonathan's final words that haunted her most. Every obstacle can be removed. It wasn't the first time he'd hinted at something sinister, but the way he said it last night had a cold finality to it. The implication sent a shiver through her, though she couldn't entirely ignore the thrill it stirred. Michael was already downstairs when she emerged, humming to himself as he read the newspaper. His optimism grated against her nerves, a stark contrast to the storm brewing inside her. She kissed him on the cheek, a gesture as routine as brushing her teeth, before setting about preparing breakfast. "You're up early," Michael said, looking over the paper. "Everything okay?" "Couldn't sleep," she replied curtly. He frowned. "You've been restless lately. Is something bothering you?" The question caught her off guard. Was Michael finally beginning to notice her emotional distance? Her mind scrambled for an excuse. "I think I'm just stressed about the women's ministry event coming up. It's a lot to organize." Michael smiled, relieved. "You always do such a great job with those. The ladies love you. Let me know if there's anything I can do to help." The sincerity in his voice stung. She mumbled a quick thank you and returned to the stove, feeling the familiar pang of guilt that accompanied every kind gesture from him. Michael wasn't a bad husband. He was kind, hardworking, and loyal. But that loyalty only made her betrayal feel heavier. Later that day, Caroline sat in her car outside the church, watching as Jonathan greeted congregants with his usual charm. Women lingered a little too long in his embrace, and men clapped him on the back as if he were a saint. To everyone else, Jonathan Grace was a moral beacon. To Caroline, he was something far more complicated, part savior, part devil. When the crowd thinned, she stepped out of her car and approached him. His eyes lit up when he saw her, a subtle smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "Caroline," he said, his voice warm. "What brings you here?" "We need to talk," she said, her voice low but firm. Jonathan nodded, his demeanor calm. "Of course. Let's go to my office." The pastor's office was a stark contrast to his public persona, dark wood-paneled walls, a cluttered desk, and bookshelves overflowing with theological texts. Caroline perched on the edge of a chair, her hands fidgeting in her lap. Jonathan closed the door behind him, the lock clicking softly, before sitting across from her. "What's on your mind?" he asked, leaning forward. Caroline hesitated. The words felt heavy on her tongue. "Last night, what you said about Michael being an obstacle. What exactly did you mean by that?" Jonathan's eyes searched hers, his expression unreadable. "I mean that we can't live like this forever. Hiding, sneaking around, it's not sustainable. You deserve a life where you're truly happy, Caroline." Her breath caught. "But you're talking about something permanent." Jonathan leaned back, his hands clasped together. "I'm talking about freedom. You're trapped in a loveless marriage. And me? I'm tired of pretending to be someone I'm not. Michael doesn't deserve you, Caroline. He never did." His words, laced with conviction, struck a chord deep within her. It was as if he could see her darkest desires and give voice to them, absolving her of responsibility. "But what are you saying, Jonathan? That we—" "I'm saying," he interrupted, "that we think about our future. Together. And that means making hard choices." Over the next week, Jonathan began to lay the groundwork for their plan, planting seeds in Caroline's mind and carefully nurturing them. He spoke of hypothetical scenarios, asking her to imagine a life without Michael, a life where they could be free. His manipulations were subtle, cloaked in the guise of love and concern, but Caroline felt their weight nonetheless. Meanwhile, Michael continued his daily routines, blissfully unaware of the storm brewing around him. He worked long hours, attended church events, and shared meals with Caroline, all the while believing their life was perfect. Caroline, however, began to see her husband in a new light. Every small annoyance, his predictable habits, his unshakable optimism became amplified. Jonathan's words echoed in her mind. "You deserve more." One evening, as they sat together on the couch, Michael reached for her hand. "You know I love you, right?" Caroline forced a smile. "Of course. You've been distant lately," he said, concern etched into his features. "I just want to make sure you're okay." For a moment, the guilt threatened to overwhelm her. But then she thought of Jonathan, of his promises and his unwavering belief that their love was worth any sacrifice. She withdrew her hand and stood. "I'm fine. Just tired." Michael watched her retreat upstairs, confusion and hurt flickering across his face. Caroline shut the bedroom door behind her and leaned against it, her heart pounding. The perfect mask she'd worn for years was beginning to slip, and she wasn't sure how much longer she could keep it in place. The next day, Jonathan called her. His voice was calm but firm. "It's time, Caroline. We need to decide what our future looks like." Her stomach twisted. She knew what he meant, even if he didn't say it outright. The choice was hers to make, but Jonathan had already done the heavy lifting, convincing her that life without Michael was the only path to true happiness. As the call ended, Caroline stared out the window, the weight of her decision pressing down on her. She wasn't just standing on the edge of a moral cliff, she was being pushed. Chapter 3. Cracks in the Foundation. Caroline Harper spent the morning pacing the living room, her thoughts swirling in a storm of doubt and anticipation. The sunlight filtering through the curtains did little to soothe her nerves. Jonathan's words from the night before echoed in her mind, relentless and persuasive. "It's time to decide." Each step she took on the worn carpet felt heavier than the last. She thought about Michael, his laughter, his kindness, his unrelenting faith in her, even when she didn't deserve it. But alongside those memories were the frustrations, the monotonous routine, the lack of excitement, and the undeniable thrill Jonathan brought into her life. She hated herself for what she was about to do, but a darker part of her whispered, "You deserve this." Michael came home early that afternoon, carrying a bouquet of lilies, her favorite. His bright smile faltered when he saw her face, pale and drawn. "You okay?" he asked, setting the flowers down on the counter. Caroline blinked, quickly plastering on a smile. "I'm fine. Just a little tired." Michael wrapped an arm around her, pulling her into a warm embrace. "You've been working too hard. Maybe we should take a weekend trip, just the two of us. What do you think?" Caroline stiffened in his arms, guilt washing over her like a cold wave. A weekend away wouldn't fix what was broken. She forced a laugh. "That sounds nice. Let me think about it." "Great," Michael said, his mood lifting. "I'll start looking at places tonight." As he kissed her cheek and walked away, Caroline felt the cracks in her resolve deepen. How could she even entertain Jonathan's plan when Michael was so kind, so trusting? But then her phone buzzed in her pocket, pulling her back into the web she and Jonathan had spun. "Jonathan, call me when you're alone. We need to talk." Caroline found herself back in Jonathan's office later that evening. The church was quiet, the dim lighting casting long shadows across the room. Jonathan leaned against his desk, his arms crossed, his expression calm but determined. "We're running out of time, Caroline," he said. "Michael's not stupid. He'll figure it out eventually." "No, he won't," Caroline argued, her voice trembling. "He trusts me. He'd never suspect." Jonathan stepped closer, his gaze intense. "And what happens when he does? Do you want to live the rest of your life hiding, lying, pretending? Or do you want to be free?" Caroline shook her head, tears welling in her eyes. "I can't do this. I can't just." Jonathan cupped her face in his hands, his voice softening. "Listen to me. I love you. Everything I've done, every risk I've taken, has been for us. But we can't have a future if Michael's still in the picture. You know that." His words cut through her defenses, and for a moment, she allowed herself to believe him. Jonathan wasn't just asking her to commit a crime. He was offering her a way out of the cage she'd built for herself. She closed her eyes, leaning into his touch.
How?
Jonathan's lips curved into a small, satisfied smile. Leave that to me. Over the next few days, Jonathan began laying the groundwork for their plan. He spoke in vague terms, careful to avoid implicating himself, but his intentions were clear. Caroline's role would be simple: keep Michael distracted, act as though everything was normal, and let Jonathan handle the rest. But as the days wore on, Caroline found it harder to maintain her composure. She jumped every time Michael spoke to her, her heart racing at the slightest noise. The guilt was eating away at her, and it didn't go unnoticed. "You've been acting strange lately," Michael said one evening as they sat on the couch. "Is there something you're not telling me?" Caroline forced a laugh, her hands trembling as she clutched her mug of tea. "Of course not. I've just been stressed with the women's ministry and everything." Michael studied her for a long moment, his brow furrowing. "You know you can talk to me, right? About anything." The sincerity in his voice was unbearable. Caroline nodded quickly, avoiding his gaze. "I know." That night, as Michael slept beside her, Caroline lay awake, staring at the ceiling. Her mind replayed Jonathan's promises over and over: freedom, happiness, and new life. But the weight of what they were planning threatened to crush her. She slipped out of bed and into the bathroom, locking the door behind her. Staring at her reflection in the mirror, she barely recognized the woman looking back. Her once bright eyes were dull, her complexion pale. The vibrant, confident woman she used to be was gone, replaced by someone consumed by guilt and fear. Her phone buzzed on the counter, breaking the silence. It was Jonathan. "Jonathan, are you ready?" Caroline's fingers hovered over the screen. She thought about Michael's smile, his unwavering faith in her. And she thought about Jonathan, his intensity, his passion, his promise of a better life. With trembling hands, she typed a single word: "Caroline, yes." The following day, Caroline threw herself into preparations for the women's ministry event, hoping to distract herself from the dark path she'd chosen. But no matter how hard she tried, the weight of her decision loomed over her like a storm cloud. As she stood in the church kitchen arranging trays of sandwiches, one of the other women, Linda, approached her. "You've seemed off lately," Linda said, her tone gentle but probing. "Is everything okay at home?" Caroline's heart skipped a beat. "Of course. Why wouldn't it be?" Linda shrugged, her gaze lingering on Caroline. "I don't know. Just a feeling. If you ever need to talk." Caroline forced a smile. "Thanks, but I'm fine."
Really?
But as Linda walked away, Caroline couldn't shake the feeling that her carefully constructed mask was beginning to slip. And she knew that if anyone saw the truth beneath it, the consequences would be catastrophic. Chapter 4: Love and Lies. Caroline Harper walked through her house, her fingers grazing the familiar surfaces of framed photos, polished furniture, and the kitchen counters where she and Michael had shared countless meals. The walls of her home felt suffocating now, closing in on her with every step. The weight of Jonathan's plan pressed heavily on her chest. It wasn't just her life that hung in the balance, it was Michael's, too. But Jonathan's voice, calm and persuasive, echoed in her mind. "We can't be free if he's still here." The words haunted her, as much for their audacity as for the way they made sense in her distorted reality. Michael sat in his favorite recliner that evening, flipping through channels with a contented expression. The sight of him, so comfortable and at peace, twisted Caroline's stomach into knots. She could hear the faint hum of a football game in the background, his low chuckle as a commentator cracked a joke. "Caroline," he called, his voice pulling her out of her daze. "Come sit with me for a bit." Forcing a smile, she walked over and perched on the arm of his chair. Michael reached for her hand, lacing his fingers through hers. His touch, once a source of comfort, now felt like a brand, searing her with guilt. "I've been thinking about our weekend getaway," he said. "Maybe we should go to that cabin in Aspen we loved so much. What do you think?" Her throat tightened. The thought of being alone with him, away from distractions, filled her with dread. "I don't know if I can get away right now." The ministry event is coming up, and there's so much to do. Michael frowned, concern clouding his face. You've been so busy lately. I just want us to have some time together, away from everything. Caroline bit her lip, her mind racing for an excuse. Let's talk about it after the event. I promise I'll make time for us. Michael smiled, his faith in her unwavering. Okay, we'll figure it out. His innocence was a knife to her heart. She kissed his forehead and stood, excusing herself to the bedroom. Once behind the closed door, she sank onto the bed, burying her face in her hands. Every fiber of her being screamed at her to stop what she was doing, to confess everything and beg for forgiveness. But Jonathan's hold on her was too strong, his promises too tempting. The next morning, Caroline met Jonathan in a secluded park just outside of town. The crisp air carried the scent of pine, and the sound of rustling leaves offered a false sense of peace. Jonathan was already waiting, leaning against his car with his arms crossed. He straightened when he saw her, his smile warm and disarming. You came, he said, stepping toward her. I don't know how much longer I can do this, Caroline admitted, her voice trembling. Michael isn't some monster. He doesn't deserve. Michael doesn't understand you, Jonathan interrupted, his tone firm. He doesn't see the woman you are, the woman you're meant to be. I do, Caroline. I've always seen you. She looked away, tears brimming in her eyes. But killing him, I don't know if I can live with that. Jonathan reached for her hands, holding them tightly. You won't have to. I'll take care of everything. You just need to trust me. His words were like a drug, numbing her fears and convincing her that this was the only way. She nodded reluctantly, her silence giving him the answer he wanted. Over the next few days, Jonathan began finalizing their plan. He kept the details vague, protecting Caroline from knowing too much. The less you know, the better, he told her. It's for your safety. Caroline went through her days in a haze, barely able to focus on her responsibilities. She avoided Michael as much as possible, feigning headaches or exhaustion to escape his questions. But even as she tried to maintain her distance, Michael's concern grew. One evening, he sat across from her at the dinner table, his gaze searching hers. You're not yourself lately, he said. Are you sure everything's okay? Caroline forced a smile, her hands gripping her fork tightly. I told you I'm just stressed with the ministry. Once the event is over, I'll be fine. Michael didn't look convinced, but he didn't push. I'm here if you need me, he said softly. Always. Her heart twisted painfully. She wanted to scream, to tell him the truth, to beg him to run as far away as possible. But the words caught in her throat, swallowed by her fear and Jonathan's influence. As the day of the plan approached, Caroline found herself standing in the church sanctuary, staring at the stained glass window above the altar. The vibrant colors seemed to mock her, their beauty a stark contrast to the darkness in her heart. Linda, one of the ministry leaders, approached her with a warm smile. Caroline, you've done such a wonderful job with the event. Everything is coming together beautifully. Caroline managed a weak smile. Thank you, Linda. I just want everything to go smoothly. It will, Linda assured her. She hesitated, her expression turning serious. I've been meaning to ask, are you okay? You've seemed off lately. Caroline's chest tightened. I'm fine, really. Just tired. Linda didn't look convinced. If there's anything you need, don't hesitate to ask. Sometimes we all need someone to lean on. Caroline nodded quickly, eager to end the conversation. As Linda walked away, Caroline felt the weight of her secrets pressing down on her, threatening to crush her. That night, Jonathan called her. His voice was calm, almost soothing. Tomorrow's the day. Caroline's heart stopped. So soon? We've waited long enough, he said. After tomorrow, we'll finally be free. Her hands trembled as she clutched the phone. What do you need me to do? Just stick to the plan, Jonathan said. I'll handle the rest. As the call ended, Caroline sat in the dark, her mind racing. She had crossed a line, one she could never uncross. And tomorrow, there would be no turning back. Chapter 5. The Plan. The morning dawned quiet and unassuming, the kind of day that could have passed as ordinary in any other life. But for Caroline Harper, this was the day her world would change forever. She sat on the edge of the bed, staring at her reflection in the mirror. Her face looked pale, her eyes hollowed by weeks of sleepless nights and mounting guilt. Michael stirred behind her, his groggy voice pulling her from her thoughts. "You're up early." Caroline forced a smile. "Couldn't sleep." Michael sat up, stretching. "Big day with the women's ministry, right?" "Yes," she lied. The words tasted bitter on her tongue. "Lots to do." He nodded, oblivious to the weight of her words. "Let me know if you need help. I'll be working from home most of the day." Her stomach twisted at the thought of what lay ahead. She kissed his cheek before leaving the room, the gesture feeling mechanical, empty. She couldn't let him see the truth. Not now, not when everything was about to fall apart. Jonathan's instructions had been clear: keep Michael at home and distracted. Jonathan would handle the rest. The vagueness of the plan unnerved her, but she told herself it was better this way. The less she knew, the easier it would be to feign ignorance later. In the kitchen, Caroline busied herself with making coffee and preparing breakfast. The familiar routine helped calm her nerves, if only temporarily. When Michael joined her at the table, she forced herself to engage in small talk, laughing at his jokes and nodding at his stories about work. She hated how normal it all felt, how easy it was to pretend. By midday, Michael was in his home office, typing away on his laptop. Caroline lingered in the hallway, her heart pounding as she debated what to do next. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, startling her. It was a message from Jonathan. "Jonathan, on my way. Be ready." Caroline's breath caught in her throat. It was happening. There was no turning back now. She typed a quick reply and slipped her phone back into her pocket, her hands trembling. "Caroline, okay." The minutes stretched into hours as Caroline waited for Jonathan's signal. The tension was suffocating, each passing moment tightening the noose around her neck. She kept herself busy by cleaning the house, but her mind was elsewhere, consumed by the weight of her decision. Finally, her phone buzzed again. This time it was a call. "Hello," she answered, her voice barely above a whisper. "It's me," Jonathan said. "I'm parked down the street." "Is he alone?" Caroline peeked into the office, where Michael sat hunched over his laptop, engrossed in his work. "Yes." "Good," Jonathan said. "I'll be there in 5 minutes. Leave the back door unlocked." Her throat tightened. "Jonathan, are you sure about this?" "I'm sure," he said firmly. "We've talked about this, Caroline. It's the only way." She nodded, even though he couldn't see her. "Okay. Good girl," he said. "See you soon." Caroline unlocked the back door with shaking hands, her heart pounding in her chest. She felt like a puppet on strings, her movements dictated by Jonathan's commands. As she stood in the kitchen, waiting for his arrival, she caught a glimpse of herself in the window. The woman staring back at her looked like a stranger. When the door creaked open, she jumped. Jonathan stepped inside, his expression calm and focused. He was dressed in dark clothing, a baseball cap pulled low over his face. In his hand, he carried a small duffel bag. "Is he still in the office?" Jonathan asked. Caroline nodded, her voice failing her. She watched as Jonathan set the bag down on the counter and unzipped it, revealing a gun and a pair of gloves. Her stomach churned at the sight. "Jonathan," she began, but he cut her off. "Go upstairs," he said. "You don't need to see this." She hesitated, torn between obeying him and stopping him. What if he won't, Jonathan said firmly. "Trust me." Her legs felt like lead as she climbed the stairs, each step a battle against the voice in her head screaming at her to stop. When she reached the bedroom, she shut the door and sat on the bed, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. She could hear her heart pounding in her ears, drowning out every other sound. Downstairs, Jonathan moved with precision, slipping on the gloves and checking the gun. He walked toward the office, his footsteps silent on the hardwood floor. Michael didn't notice him at first, too focused on his computer screen. When he finally looked up, his brow furrowed in confusion. "Jonathan? What are you?" The sound of the gunshot was deafening, shattering the stillness of the house. Caroline flinched, her breath catching in her throat. For a moment, everything was silent, as if the world itself had stopped. Then she heard Jonathan's voice. "It's done." Her body went numb. She stumbled to the bathroom, gripping the edge of the sink as she tried to steady herself. Her reflection stared back at her, pale and trembling. She felt like she was going to be sick. Jonathan came upstairs a few minutes later, his expression calm and composed. "It's over," he said, his voice low. "We need to stick to the plan. I'll take care of the cleanup." Caroline couldn't bring herself to respond. She felt like a ghost, her body moving on autopilot as Jonathan guided her through the next steps. She barely registered his words, her mind consumed by the image of Michael's lifeless body downstairs. As Jonathan left the house, promising to dispose of the evidence, Caroline sat alone in the bedroom, her hands stained with metaphorical blood. The perfect life Jonathan had promised felt further away than ever. All she had now was the weight of her guilt, and the knowledge that there was no escaping the consequences of what they had done. Chapter 6. The Day of Reckoning. The house was eerily quiet after Jonathan left. The sound of the gunshot still echoed in Caroline's mind, reverberating through her body like a relentless drumbeat. She sat on the edge of the bed, staring at her trembling hands. They felt cold, lifeless, as if they belonged to someone else. Downstairs, her husband, Michael, lay dead, a man who had trusted her completely, a man who had loved her unconditionally. Caroline couldn't bring herself to go downstairs. She paced the bedroom, trying to calm the storm of emotions raging inside her. Guilt, fear, and regret clawed at her, each one demanding to be felt more deeply than the last. She wanted to cry, to scream, to undo everything that had happened, but she knew it was too late. The plan was in motion, and there was no turning back. Her phone buzzed on the nightstand, pulling her from her thoughts. It was a text from Jonathan. "Jonathan, everything's taken care of. Stay calm and stick to the story." She stared at the message, her chest tightening. The story. The alibi they had crafted so carefully. Jonathan had reassured her over and over again that it would work, that no one would suspect them. But now, in the aftermath, it all felt so fragile, so easy to break. Hours passed before Caroline forced herself to go downstairs. The sight that greeted her stopped her in her tracks. The office was spotless, as if nothing had happened. Jonathan had been thorough, just as he promised. But the faint scent of gunpowder lingered in the air, a ghostly reminder of what had taken place. She stood frozen in the doorway, her breath coming in shallow gasps. This was real. Michael was gone, and she had let it happen. Her phone buzzed again. It was Jonathan. "Jonathan, call the police. Tell them you came home and found him. Stick to the story." Her hands shook as she dialed 911, her voice trembling as she spoke to the dispatcher. I just got home and my husband, he's been shot." The words felt foreign on her tongue, like they belonged to someone else. She answered the dispatcher's questions as best as she could, her mind spinning with fear and adrenaline. By the time she hung up, her heart was racing so fast she thought it might burst. When the police arrived, Caroline played her part flawlessly, or so she thought. She feigned shock, her tears flowing freely as she recounted her carefully rehearsed story. "I went out to run errands, and when I came back, I found him like this," she sobbed, clutching a tissue in her hand. The officers offered her sympathetic looks, but their questions were sharp and probing. They asked about Michael's habits, his relationships, and whether he had any enemies. Caroline answered each question carefully, sticking to the script Jonathan had drilled into her. But as the hours dragged on, the cracks in her facade began to show. One of the detectives, a stern man with piercing eyes, seemed to notice. "Mrs. Harper," he said, his tone calm but firm, "is there anyone who might have wanted to hurt your husband?" Caroline shook her head quickly. "No, of course not. Michael was a good man. Everyone loved him." The detective studied her for a long moment, his gaze uncomfortably intense. "Sometimes good men have secrets," he said. "If there's anything you're not telling us, now would be the time." Her breath caught in her throat. She forced herself to meet his gaze, her voice steady. "I don't know anything. I swear." The next few days were a blur of grief and questioning. The police launched a full investigation, combing through Michael's life for clues. They interviewed friends, co-workers, and neighbors, searching for any sign of a motive. Caroline did her best to maintain her composure, but every interaction felt like a test, a trap designed to catch her in a lie. Jonathan was her anchor during this time, always reassuring her that they were safe. "They have nothing on us," he said during one of their secret phone calls. "Just keep your head down and let them chase their tails." But Caroline's guilt was becoming unbearable. She avoided the places she and Michael had frequented together, unable to face the memories. The house felt empty without him, each room a painful reminder of what she had lost. As the weeks passed, the investigation hit a wall. The police had no leads, no suspects. Jonathan's plan seemed to be working, just as he had promised. But Caroline couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to go wrong. One night, as she sat alone in the living room, there was a knock at the door. Her heart raced as she opened it to find the detective from before standing on her porch. "Mrs. Harper," he said, his expression unreadable. "I have a few more questions if you don't mind." Caroline's pulse quickened. She forced a smile and stepped aside. "Of course.
Come in."
As the detective sat across from her, his piercing gaze never wavering, Caroline felt the walls closing in. The questions came fast and sharp, probing deeper than before. And for the first time, she felt the foundation of their story begin to crack. Chapter 7. A Web Unravels. Detective Marcus Ewing sat across from Caroline Harper in the living room, his presence heavy and deliberate. His calm demeanor was disarming, but his eyes betrayed a sharpness that made Caroline uneasy. He leaned forward, his notebook resting lightly on his knee, and offered her a small, disarming smile. "I appreciate you taking the time to speak with me again, Mrs. Harper," he said, his voice smooth and professional. "I just have a few follow-up questions. I hope it's not too much of an inconvenience." Caroline clasped her hands tightly in her lap, her palms damp with sweat. "Of course. Anything I can do to help." The detective's questions started simple, details about Michael's schedule, their daily routines, his work relationships. Caroline answered each one carefully, sticking to the story Jonathan had crafted. But as the conversation continued, Marcus's tone shifted, his questions becoming more pointed. Did Michael ever mention feeling threatened by anyone? Maybe someone at work or in the community? Caroline shook her head quickly. "No, never. Michael was well-liked by everyone." Marcus tapped his pen against his notebook. "What about you? Did you notice anyone acting strangely around him? A friend, a co-worker, even a stranger?" Caroline hesitated, her mind racing for an answer. "No," she said finally. "I didn't notice anything unusual." Marcus's gaze lingered on her, as if he were trying to read her thoughts. "It's interesting," he said, his tone casual, "that there's no sign of forced entry. Whoever did this either had a key or was let in. That narrows down the suspects quite a bit." Caroline felt her throat tighten. I guess that makes sense. But I wouldn't know who." "Of course," Marcus interrupted gently. "I'm just thinking out loud." As the detective continued to question her, Caroline felt the pressure building. She could feel the cracks in her story growing wider, each question chipping away at her composure. She tried to keep her answers short and consistent, but the weight of her guilt made it harder to maintain the facade. Finally, Marcus closed his notebook and leaned back in his chair. "Thank you for your time, Mrs. Harper. I won't take up any more of your evening." Caroline nodded, relief washing over her. "If there's anything else you need, just let me know." Marcus stood and offered her a polite smile. "You've been very helpful. Have a good night." As she closed the door behind him, Caroline leaned against it, her heart pounding. She had managed to hold it together for now. But she couldn't shake the feeling that Marcus wasn't convinced. He had planted seeds of doubt, and she knew it was only a matter of time before they grew into something much more dangerous. Jonathan called later that night, his tone calm but urgent. "How did it go?" Caroline hesitated, still shaken from the encounter. "He's suspicious. He kept asking questions about the break-in, about who might have had access to the house? Did you stick to the story? Jonathan asked. Yes, she said quickly. But I don't think he believes me. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. Don't panic, Jonathan said finally. They don't have any evidence. As long as we stay consistent, they can't touch us. Caroline closed her eyes, trying to calm her racing thoughts. I don't know if I can do this, Jonathan. I feel like I'm falling apart. You're stronger than you think, he said, his voice firm. We've come this far. There's no turning back now. The days that followed were a blur of anxiety and dread. Caroline found herself jumping at every sound, convinced that the police were about to knock on her door and haul her away. She avoided Jonathan as much as possible, the sight of him only serving to remind her of the terrible thing they had done. But Jonathan was relentless, calling and texting her constantly, reassuring her that everything would be fine. You're overthinking it, he told her during one of their conversations. The detective's just fishing. He doesn't have anything on us. Despite his reassurances, Caroline couldn't shake the feeling that the walls were closing in. Every time she stepped outside, she felt the weight of the community's eyes on her. Whispers followed her wherever she went, the townspeople speculating about Michael's death and the woman left behind. One evening, as Caroline sat alone in the living room, there was another knock at the door. Her heart leapt into her throat as she opened it to find Linda, one of her closest friends from the church, standing on the porch. Hi, Caroline, Linda said, her expression kind but concerned. I just wanted to check on you. I know things have been difficult. Caroline forced a smile. Thanks, Linda. That's really thoughtful of you. Linda stepped inside, her eyes scanning the room. I've been meaning to ask, have the police made any progress? Do they have any leads? Caroline shook her head. Not that I know of. They've been asking a lot of questions, but nothing concrete. Linda nodded slowly, her gaze lingering on Caroline. I can't imagine what you're going through. If you ever need to talk. Caroline's smile faltered. Thanks, Linda. I appreciate it. As Linda left, Caroline felt a wave of unease wash over her. She couldn't tell if Linda's concern was genuine or if it masked something more probing. The paranoia was becoming unbearable, and she knew she couldn't keep living like this. That night, Caroline sat alone in the dark, her thoughts racing. The perfect plan Jonathan had promised was starting to unravel, and she could feel herself slipping further into despair. She wanted to believe that they could get away with it, but deep down, she knew the truth. The web they had woven was beginning to collapse, and it was only a matter of time before everything came crashing down. Chapter 8. Truth Comes to Light. Caroline Harper woke to the sound of knocking at her door. Her heart immediately leaped into her throat. For a moment, she thought it was a dream, the kind of noise that haunts restless nights. But the knocking came again, sharp and deliberate. Sliding out of bed, she grabbed her robe and made her way downstairs, each step feeling like it might give way beneath her. Through the peephole, she saw Detective Marcus Ewing standing on her porch, his expression calm but unreadable. Behind him, another officer loomed, clipboard in hand. She opened the door, her voice shaking. Detective. It's early. Is something wrong? Marcus offered her a thin smile. Good morning, Mrs. Harper. I'm sorry to disturb you, but we've come across some new information in your husband's case. May we come in? Caroline hesitated, gripping the doorframe for support. Of course. In the living room, Marcus took his usual spot on the couch, while the second officer remained by the door. The air was thick with tension as Marcus pulled out his notebook, flipping to a fresh page. We've been reviewing Michael's case, he began, and something caught our attention. The security camera footage from a neighbor's property showed a car parked near your home the night of the murder. A black sedan, to be exact. Caroline froze. Jonathan drove a black sedan. She could feel the blood draining from her face. That's strange, she managed to say, her voice unsteady. I don't know anyone who drives a car like that. Marcus raised an eyebrow. Really? It seemed to stay there for quite a while before leaving the area shortly after we estimate the time of the shooting. Caroline swallowed hard. Maybe it was a delivery driver or someone lost. I wouldn't know. The detective scribbled something in his notebook, his gaze never leaving her. "We're also reviewing phone records. Standard procedure in cases like this. If there's anything you think might help us, now would be the time to share." Caroline's pulse quickened. She forced herself to keep her breathing steady. "I wish I knew more, Detective. I really do." Marcus leaned back, studying her for a moment. "I understand. If anything comes to mind, please let us know." With that, he stood, nodding to the officer by the door. "Thank you for your time, Mrs. Harper." As the door closed behind them, Caroline collapsed onto the couch, her hands trembling. She had been careful, hadn't she? Jonathan had reassured her that there was no way to connect them to the crime. But now, with surveillance footage and phone records coming into play, the walls were closing in faster than she could manage. Jonathan was furious when she called him. "Why didn't you tell me about the cameras?" he hissed. "I didn't know." Caroline shot back, her voice shaking. "I didn't even know the neighbors had cameras." Jonathan cursed under his breath. "This complicates things. They're digging deeper than I expected." "They mentioned phone records too," she said, her panic rising. "What if they connect us?" "They won't," Jonathan said firmly. "You deleted our messages, didn't you?" "Yes, but what if they still—"
"They won't," he snapped.
"You're panicking for no reason. Let me handle this." Caroline wanted to believe him, but the confidence in his voice wasn't as convincing as it once had been. The cracks in their plan were widening, and she could feel herself slipping closer to the edge. The next few days were a blur of anxiety and paranoia. Caroline avoided the church, unable to face the congregation or Jonathan. Her every waking moment was consumed by fear, each knock at the door or unfamiliar face in the neighborhood, setting her on edge. Linda stopped by again, her concern more pointed this time. "Caroline, I don't mean to pry, but something feels off. You've been so distant lately, and I know this has been hard on you. But—" "I'm fine," Caroline interrupted, her tone sharper than she intended. "I'm just trying to process everything." Linda hesitated, clearly unconvinced. "If you say so. But, you know, the truth always comes out in the end. It has a way of finding us, whether we're ready for it or not." Caroline's heart sank as she watched Linda leave. The truth. That word haunted her like a ghost, lingering in every corner of her mind. That night, Detective Marcus Ewing called her. "Mrs. Harper, we'd like you to come down to the station tomorrow," he said, his tone neutral but firm. "There are a few things we'd like to clarify." Her heart sank. "Am I in trouble?" "Not at all," Marcus said. "We just have some questions." "It's routine." Routine. The word felt like a lie. Caroline knew this was anything but routine. She ended the call and immediately dialed Jonathan. "They want me to come to the station," she said, her voice trembling. "They're going to question me." "Then you stick to the story," Jonathan said, his voice cold and steady. "Do not let them break you, Caroline. They don't have anything." But as the call ended, Caroline realized something chilling. She no longer trusted Jonathan. The man who had once seemed so confident, so in control, now felt like a sinking ship dragging her down with him. The next morning, Caroline sat in the interrogation room at the police station, her hands folded tightly in her lap. Detective Marcus Ewing sat across from her, his expression calm but unreadable. "Thank you for coming in," he said. "This shouldn't take long." He began with familiar questions, ones she had answered before. But as the minutes passed, his tone shifted, becoming sharper, more direct. "Mrs. Harper," he said finally, "we've reviewed Michael's phone records. It seems he had several missed calls from your number the day of his death. Can you explain that?" Caroline's stomach dropped. She had called Michael repeatedly to establish her alibi, just as Jonathan had instructed. I was trying to reach him," she said. "I wanted to see if he needed anything while I was out." Marcus nodded, but his eyes remained fixed on her. "And what about your own phone records? We noticed a lot of calls and messages between you and Pastor Grace." Caroline froze. Her carefully constructed story began to crumble under the weight of his words. She opened her mouth to respond, but no sound came out. Marcus leaned forward, his voice low. "Mrs. Harper, if there's something you're not telling us, Now is the time to come clean. Her chest tightened, her breath coming in shallow gasps. She could feel the walls closing in, the truth clawing its way to the surface. For the first time, she realized she couldn't run from it anymore. Chapter 9. The Trial. Caroline Harper sat in the courtroom, the weight of her choices pressing down on her like a physical burden. The murmurs of the gathered crowd hummed like a swarm of angry bees, each whisper cutting into her already frayed nerves. At the defense table, Jonathan Grace sat beside his attorney, his face a mask of stoicism. He didn't glance her way, didn't acknowledge her presence. She felt utterly alone. The police had pieced it all together. The phone records, the surveillance footage, the timeline of events. But the damning blow had come from Caroline herself. Under the pressure of Detective Marcus Ewing's relentless questioning, she had cracked, spilling the truth in a flood of tears and regret. Her confession had led to Jonathan's arrest, and now they both stood accused of first-degree murder. Caroline had agreed to a plea deal, trading her testimony against Jonathan for a reduced sentence. It was a decision that filled her with shame, but it was also her only hope of escaping a life behind bars. The prosecution painted a chilling picture of the crime. They described how Jonathan had used his position as a pastor to manipulate Caroline, preying on her vulnerabilities and convincing her that murder was the only solution to their forbidden love. The prosecutor's voice was steady and cold as he detailed how they had plotted Michael's death, calling it a calculated and callous act of betrayal. Caroline's attorney tried to shift the blame onto Jonathan, portraying her as a victim of his influence. Mrs. Harper was caught in the web of a manipulative man, he argued. She was not the mastermind of this crime, but a pawn in his dangerous game. Jonathan's defense was just as ruthless. His attorney painted Caroline as the instigator, claiming she had manipulated Jonathan into committing the crime for her own selfish reasons. She wanted a life of freedom and luxury without her husband, he said, his voice dripping with disdain. Pastor Grace was merely a tool for her ambitions. As the trial dragged on, Caroline felt the cracks in her soul deepening. Each testimony, each piece of evidence, was another reminder of how far she had fallen. Friends and neighbors took the stand, describing her as a kind and loving woman, someone they never would have suspected of such a heinous act. Their words were a dagger to her heart, a painful reminder of the mask she had worn for so long. Jonathan, when he took the stand, was cold and calculating. He denied everything, his voice steady as he claimed he had been framed. "I would never harm anyone," he said, his eyes scanning the courtroom. "I have dedicated my life to helping others, to spreading God's word." This is a tragic misunderstanding. Caroline could barely look at him. The man who had once promised her freedom now felt like a stranger. The jury deliberated for days, the weight of the evidence heavy on their shoulders. Caroline spent those hours in a holding cell, her mind racing with regret and self-loathing. She thought of Michael, his smile, his laughter, the way he had always believed in her. She had destroyed him. And for what? A man who had used her as a means to an end? When the verdict finally came, it was swift and devastating. Jonathan was found guilty on all counts: conspiracy to commit murder, first-degree murder, and obstruction of justice. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Caroline's plea deal spared her from the same fate, but she was far from free. She received a sentence of 25 years in prison, a punishment she felt she fully deserved. As she was led out of the courtroom, the murmurs of the crowd followed her, a chorus of judgment and disbelief. In the weeks that followed, Caroline began to settle into the grim reality of her new life. Prison was cold and unrelenting, a place where guilt and regret were her constant companions. She spent her days working in the laundry, her nights lying awake in her cell, replaying the events that had led her here. Jonathan, she learned, was struggling to adjust to his own imprisonment. Rumors of his clashes with other inmates reached her through the prison grapevine, but she found little comfort in his suffering. Her anger toward him had faded, replaced by a hollow sadness. He had destroyed her life, but she had let him. They were both to blame. One afternoon, Caroline received a visit from Detective Marcus Ewing. She hadn't expected to see him again, but his presence brought a strange sense of closure. "I wanted to check on you," he said, his tone unusually kind. "See how you're holding up?" Caroline nodded, her voice quiet. "I'm surviving." Marcus studied her for a moment before speaking again. "You did the right thing coming clean. It took courage." She let out a bitter laugh. "It wasn't courage. It was desperation." "Maybe," Marcus said. "But now, at least, you have a chance to rebuild. To make something of the life you still have." His words lingered with her long after he left. Rebuild. She wasn't sure if that was possible, but she knew she had to try. In the quiet of her cell that night, Caroline wrote a letter to Michael's family. It was a letter she knew they might never read, but she needed to write it anyway. "I don't expect forgiveness," she wrote. "I don't deserve it. But I want you to know that I loved Michael, even if my actions didn't show it. He was a good man, and I will carry the weight of what I've done for the rest of my life." As she signed her name, a single tear fell onto the page. It was a small gesture, but it felt like the first step toward something she couldn't yet define. Maybe not redemption, but at least acknowledgement of her sins. Chapter 10. The Price of Betrayal. The months that followed Caroline Harper's sentencing were a haze of monotony and reflection. The sterile walls of her prison cell became both her punishment and her sanctuary. Each day began the same: the clanging of metal doors, the shouted roll call, and the echo of heavy boots on the cold, concrete floors. Caroline adjusted to the rhythm of life behind bars, but the memories of her past never gave her peace. They followed her through the endless days and into the long, sleepless nights, reminding her of the cost of her choices. One morning, as she sat in the prison library, Caroline was approached by an inmate named Teresa. Teresa was older, with graying hair pulled into a loose bun and a face lined with years of hard living. She slid into the chair across from Caroline, her sharp eyes studying her. "You're the one who helped kill her husband, aren't you?" Teresa said bluntly, her voice low but firm. Caroline flinched at the words but nodded, unable to deny it. "I thought so," Teresa said, leaning back in her chair. "You've got that look, like the guilt's eating you alive." Caroline glanced around nervously, unsure how to respond. Teresa's gaze softened, and she leaned in closer. "Listen, I've been in here a long time," she said. "And if there's one thing I've learned, it's that guilt can kill you faster than anything else in this place. You need to find a way to live with what you've done, or it'll swallow you whole." Her words struck a chord with Caroline. She spent the rest of the day thinking about them, wondering if it was truly possible to find a way forward. Weeks later, Caroline began attending a support group for inmates grappling with guilt and remorse. The sessions were raw and emotional, filled with stories of pain and regret. For the first time, Caroline found herself opening up about Michael, about Jonathan, and about the choices that had led her to this place. "I don't know if I'll ever forgive myself," she admitted during one session. "But I want to try." For him. For Michael. The group leader, a former inmate named Grace, nodded thoughtfully. "Forgiveness doesn't mean forgetting what you've done. It means finding a way to honor the people you've hurt by becoming better than you were. It's hard work, but it's worth it." As the months turned into years, Caroline began to rebuild herself piece by piece. She volunteered for every program available: literacy tutoring, counseling, and even a workshop on restorative justice. Her work earned her respect among the other inmates and even the prison staff. Slowly, she started to feel like she was making amends, even if only in small ways. But some wounds could never be healed. Michael's family never responded to the letter she had written, and she understood why. She didn't expect their forgiveness. She only hoped that someday they would find peace. One day, Caroline received unexpected news. Jonathan Grace had been killed in a prison fight. The guards offered no details, only a brief acknowledgement that he was gone. Caroline's reaction surprised her. She didn't feel relief or vindication, only a deep, hollow sadness. Jonathan had been many things: a manipulator, a liar, a murderer. But he had also been a man who once made her feel seen and desired. His death was a grim reminder of the destruction they had wrought together, a final chapter in a story that had already taken so much from her. On the 10th anniversary of Michael's death, Caroline sat alone in her cell, staring at the small photo she had managed to keep of him. It was a candid shot from a picnic years ago, his face lit up with laughter. She traced the edges of the photo with her finger, her heart heavy with regret. "I'm sorry," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "For everything." She didn't expect forgiveness, but speaking the words felt like a release, a small step toward healing. When Caroline was finally granted parole after serving 15 years of her sentence, she stepped out into a world that felt unfamiliar and daunting. The town of Cedar Ridge had moved on, but the scars of her actions lingered. She chose not to return, instead settling in a distant city where she could start anew. She found work at a nonprofit organization that helped women rebuild their lives after trauma and incarceration. The irony wasn't lost on her, but she poured herself into the work, hoping to make a difference for others. In helping them, she found a measure of purpose she had never known before. The years that followed were quiet and reflective. Caroline lived simply, avoiding attention and focusing on her work. She never remarried, never sought out the kind of love that had once led her astray. Instead, she devoted herself to honoring Michael's memory in the only way she knew how, by living a life of integrity and service. In the end, she came to understand that redemption wasn't a destination but a journey, one she would walk for the rest of her days.
Epilogue.
In a quiet cemetery on the outskirts of Cedar Ridge, a lone figure knelt before a modest gravestone. Caroline Harper traced the engraved letters of Michael's name with her fingertips, her heart heavy but steady. "I've tried to make things right," she whispered. "I hope you can see that." As she stood and walked away, the wind carried the faintest scent of lilies, Michael's favorite flower, through the air. For the first time in years, Caroline felt a sliver of peace. Her journey was far from over, but for now, she was content to take it one step at a time. The end.